All right, folks. Today in this lecture, we are going to explore some of the foundational theories from within the field of human development. Several of these theorists will show up again in later chapters, not all of them will. So without further ado, let us begin. One of the earliest beliefs that many human beings held was that of preformationism, this kind of now ludicrous idea that a developing embryo or fetus inside a mother is just simply a miniaturized, fully formed human being. And we know that this is indeed not the case because infants are not born with all their capabilities intact, and children are not miniature adults. But this is kind of consistent that with the view that human beings had about children for throughout much of human history that allowed humans to be okay with child labor. When you see children as just miniature adults, that I guess kind of makes sense. But children are not miniature adults, and their brains are not like adult brains. And there's much about children that is not similar to adults, that has not developed yet. Um, so we now know that this particular idea is basically laughable and pre-scientific. One of the earliest theorists relevant to a modern understanding of child development that your textbook mentions is the famed pediatrician and child psychologist Arnold Gessel, who was known for his work in the early 20th century, pioneering the use of video cameras to study the development of children. He was the first person to really do it, or motion picture cameras, as they called it back then. And he pioneered this technology to document the development of children. And he, in fact, recorded some of the most classic footage that's out there, which we'll see in a moment, of children's development. And based upon all of his research, he was able to develop some of the earliest standards by which pediatricians could judge the health of a developing child. And these standards became known as the Gessel developmental schedules, which aren't really in use these days. We have more modern scales that are used by pediatricians and child psychologists. However, it was an early instrument that kind of helped get the field off the ground. So at this point, I'm going to show you guys a 20 or so minute long video, I think 25-minute long video called The Beginning of Life, which contains a lot of the classic footage that Gessel filmed and, of course, narrated by himself.
All living creatures, the human infant has the most prodigious and, of course, the most fascinating powers of growth. This growth is both mental and physical. You will soon see on the screen how the infant grows and takes shape in mind as well as body. He has end. He has intelligence, feeling, will, personality. He has an inborn individuality governed by natural laws. We need a better understanding of these laws, and then we shall have a more adequate appreciation of the psychological importance of infancy. The social and economic costs of mental abnormality have now become so heavy that science is literally compelled to investigate those early life forces which determine the patterning of human behavior. We cannot manage our complex civilization unless we build firmer foundations of mental health in infant and child. Parent, nurse, doctor, and scientist all have a part to play in the protection of the mental welfare of the infant. One of the great tasks of medical science is to penetrate into the nature of human personality and into the conditions of mental health. In our clinic at Yale University, we have for many years been studying the mental growth of normal infants. Our purpose is to establish a baseline as a line of reference for the diagnosis of the mental characteristics of the infant in their early formative stages. We have used the motion picture camera as a scientific tool for charting month by month the growth of the infant's behavior, his posture and locomotion, his grasp and manipulation, his play, exploitation, learning, and his social reactions. The cinema is an ideal tool for making visible the forms and the structured essence of the mind. Here is one of the many mothers who have helped us in our program of research. She knows that we are going to make a motion picture record of her baby in a special clinical crib in a photographic dome encased in a one-way vision screen. Here is a clinical crib and the infant-sized Morris chair in which the baby will sit during part of the examination. And here are the pockets at the end of the crib, which contain the psychological test materials to be used in the developmental examination. The mother now takes her baby into the photographic dome, a glimpse of which is now before you. The baby is 16 weeks old, and already our observations have begun. This, remember, is a 16 weeks old infant. How does the infant react to the dangling ring? He gazes at it, slashes arms and legs, closes in, and finally seizes it. A primitive form of prehension, typical of 16 weeks maturity. A significant behavior pattern testifying to normal growth. The camera permanently records the growth of all these behavior patterns in the sensitive cinema film. The records of the patterns are stored away in this film for future reference. The film has an infallible memory, and the patterns can be restored to life by threading the film upon a specially designed projector. This projector throws the image of behavior upon the viewing glass of the desk. Here, for example, you see again that bit of 16 weeks old behavior in the presence of a dangling ring. The image may be studied at leisure and in great detail. Even the attitude of the baby may be traced with a pencil for detailed analysis. In this manner, we make the growth of behavior patterns visible for systematic and comparative study. Let's turn back to an infant boy at the age of 12 weeks and see what patterns of behavior are revealed in test situations. First, a simple postural test. When he is pulled to a sitting position, his head lags and drops forward. His back curves. At 16 weeks of age, his head is steadier, his trunk more rigid, and his back is not so uniformly rounded as it was at 12 weeks. This is due to the advancing organization of his growing nervous system. At 20 weeks, he erects his head nicely when he's brought to the perpendicular position. He can move his trunk slightly and can sit a moment without support when he is allowed to lean forward. Interesting changes in the course of its development. By means of animated diagrams, we shall briefly delineate the transformations which occur during the prenatal period. The anterior limb bud first appears. Then 5 knob-like structures resembling the human fingers take form. This development proceeds rapidly, and during the first 12 weeks, the beginnings of the forearm and fingernails become evident. The configurations then rapidly change, and long before birth, the hand becomes well-defined and even active. Growth continues, but 8 weeks after birth, the hand still retains some of its prenatal characteristics. The infant cannot yet lay hold of the physical world. His hand is almost a useless organ. It remains for the most part fisted, night and day. Consequently, the movements of the fingers are limited and non-adaptive. But at 24 weeks, the fingers are open. The fist has unfolded. The fingers play in a lively manner and curl over every object they touch. Slender objects like a spoon easily become entangled between the fingers, but the patterns of prehension and manipulation have clearly elaborated. Note the infant's reaction to the cube. He grasps it. When it is, he is now well beyond the stage of mere corralling. Now observe the patterns of behavior in the 2-cube situation at 24 weeks. The examiner has placed 1 cube in the infant's left hand and has presented a 2nd cube. The infant holds the first cube, but gives only momentary and secondary regard to the 2nd cube. He transfers, chews, bangs the cube, but he confines his attention chiefly to 1 cube. Even in the multiple cube situation, these patterns of behavior persist. He grasps 1 cube and gives only fleeting heed to the several cubes before him. He remains preoccupied with the cube in hand. In 4 more weeks, his behavior patterns are significantly transformed. At 28 weeks, in addition to holding the first cube, he grasps the 2nd one as soon as he sees it, and he holds both cubes. He even brings the 2 cubes together sketchily. He inspects one, then the other, and then both together. His attention as well as his grasp takes in 2 cubes. By double or coincident projection, the 2 age levels are now brought into comparative view. The pictures have been slowed to half speed, so you can divide your attention equally between them. You may make your own comparisons and draw your own deductions. The difference in complexity of these 2 sets of behavior patterns represents 1 month of mental growth. It is quite evident that time visibly transforms the patterns of prehension and manipulation. Here are depicted 6 consecutive pattern phases of cube behavior at 24 weeks. Reading from left to right, you see grasp, Transfer, inspection of the first cube, inspection of the second cube, banging, and mouthing. Turning now to 28 weeks, we see these pattern phases. Regard for the second cube, prompt approach, grasp, inspection of the first cube, then inspection of the second cube, and rubbing of the two cubes. These reactions occur in pattern sequence in less than 30 seconds. The patterns of prehension change visibly every month. This comparative view depicts the infant's manual patterns at 28 and at 40 weeks. At 40 weeks, he sits independently. He no longer needs the examining chair. He brings two cubes into constructive relationship. Let us examine more closely his patterns of behavior at 40 weeks. Finger and thumb are coming into definite opposition. And when a third cube is presented, he manages even to hold 3 cubes at one time. The index finger now takes a leading part in manipulation. Take particular notice of this index finger. He at once pokes the tip of the handle of the bell with his extended finger. He rotates the bell, rings it, presses it forward, holds it at different angles. He is under an irrepressible impulse to pry and to poke with his index finger. This is a significant, well-defined pattern of behavior, a very deep-seated pattern, which asserts itself again when a tiny pellet is presented. Once more, the index finger projects. He plucks the pellet, pursues it with the poking index finger. And when pellet and bottle are presented, again the poking index finger comes into prominent play. And now for a rapid survey of the progressive growth changes which transform the patterns of cube behavior from 12 weeks to 40 weeks. At 12 weeks, simple regard for a cube. At 16 weeks, incipient approach. At 20 weeks, corralling and contact. At 24 and 28 weeks, direct approach and grasp. At 40 weeks, exploitive combining of the two cubes. These growth changes continue with each passing month. All two children, except perhaps identical twins, grow up in the same way. Some learn to stand and to walk early, others late, but all are very likely to pass through similar stages. At the age of 8 weeks, this particular baby boy can wriggle, squirm, pull his knees up, move his hips, and flex his extended legs. 4 more weeks, and he still wriggles. He cannot pull his knees forward, nor lift his hips as he did in walk. Notice that he lies flat, but he rears his head higher and keeps his arms a little straighter. At the age of 16 weeks, he assumes a frog-like posture, appropriate enough for the water. Notice that his forequarters are more highly developed than his legs. This illustrates the law of growth. The head regions take the lead in the development of motor control, and the legs naturally lag. Now, at 20 weeks, he reared his head higher. In the water, observe that he can even bring his knees to a creeping position. He rocks back and forth, but there is no coordination between arms and legs. On the floor, he seems even more helpless. He lifts his hips occasionally, but he claws the mat and is almost riveted to the spot. But even at 24 weeks, he is laying foundations for the future. When held by his mother, he supports a little weight, makes a few stepping movements. He holds his head and trunk upright, indicating growth toward an erect posture. On the floor, he is distinctly more agile. He rolls from his stomach to his back, but from impulse rather than deliberation. When the metronome rattle begins to sound, he notices it, but he is still pretty well anchored to the spot. Four more weeks passed. Last month, you recall the baby rolled from stomach to back. This month, he can roll in the reverse direction, a more difficult feat. So he manages to secure the toy. He needs control of posture, not only for purposes of locomotion, but for purposes of prehension and of manipulation. Now you see he is approaching the creeping stage. He sustains his weight on straight rather than on bent arms. He pats his hands on the floor. He can pivot slightly. In the next 4 weeks, he becomes still more locomotor-minded. In the creeping position, take good notice, he can now extend his right arm forward and his left leg backward. This definitely anticipates creeping. But pivoting comes before creeping. Here you see the infant executing a pivot in the clockwise direction. He almost gyrates. Arms and legs are coming into better coordination. Out his right hand, turns his head, twists his body, shifts his hands, extends. This pivoting pattern represents a growth gain. The anchor is loosening. Pivoting promises progression, ultimately. 4 more weeks bring him to the verge of 50. Notice how well he supports himself by his arms. His mother no longer needs to place her hand under his chin. He pulls himself forward toward the water toy and manages, finally, to secure it. On the floor, notice how he puts his legs into the creeping position and advances by a combination of crawling, creeping, and wriggling. Observe the increased agility in his movements, the flexibility of his trunk. And now at 40 weeks, he creeps. He goes directly for the rattle and renews his inveterate manipulation. Without assistance, he assumes the erect posture, cruises around his pen by a combination of clambering and side-stepping. Cruising is an intermediate stage between creeping and walking. Both in cruising and in creeping, the hands are still used for locomotion. When he feels the tingle of the grass, he goes completely on all fours. His hands become feet, and you have a classic example of quadrupedal locomotion, creeping on all fours. Notice at the age of 44 weeks how versatile his postural behavior has become. See how he changes rapidly from one attitude to another. Already he is less engrossed in pure locomotion. He sits, he kneels, he stands, but never does he cease to exploit all objects within his reach. He splashes, dabbles, pokes, and investigates. Constantly he brings his abilities into correlation. Posture, prehension, locomotion, and adaptive behavior roll together. He does not develop first one ability and then another. He grows as a unit. Nature sees to it that he brings your abilities into ever-advancing combinations. On the floor, he is far from helpless. He pivots and reaches his goal. Notice the screwdriver action of his wrist and forearm. At 48 weeks, you witness further changes. There is little danger that this boy will prefer the quadrupedal method of locomotion. He is extremely efficient on all fours, but he cannot escape the force of intrinsic rule. Nor can his mother. He is now under the irrepressible impulse to stand on his two own feet. He is truly becoming a biped. Ready for his first guiding steps. His legs are willing, but his trunk bends backward, his stomach forward. But notice that even at this precarious early stage, he tries to wave the rattle and to walk at the same time. Nature does not divide his tasks into small bits. She always makes demands on his total organism. 1 year old, and he walks quite alone, but not without some effort, as testified by a protruding stomach and also by a protruding tongue. During the next half year, he walked and with plenty of knee action, the adept balance over sticks in his footprint. The progressive stages by which this baby attained his posture and locomotion will now pass throughout in brief review. 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 weeks, 24 weeks, 28 weeks, 36 weeks, 40 weeks, 44 weeks, 48 weeks, 52 weeks, 18 months, gradations. The boy learned to walk. Welcome to
So back to our slides. I apologize if there were any audio or visual issues during that. That film can be found on YouTube as well. It's called Life Begins with Arnold Gessel. All right, so let's get back to the slides here. The next person that I want to mention tonight in this lecture is Sigmund Freud, who is probably one of the most well-known names in your textbook. You really can't talk about developmental psychology without his ideas coming up. He is most well-known for being the founder of psychoanalysis, which is basically the first version of psychotherapy that ever existed. So we can thank him in large part for the existence of clinical psychology, counseling, psychotherapy. He started his career in the late 1800s as a neurologist who ended up kind of specializing in studying people who were suffering from mental illnesses back then referred to as madness, or hysteria was a popular term. And he was one of the earliest folks to come to the discovery that people could actually be helped by just letting them talk about their problems. This became known as the talking cure. Again, he referred to it as psychoanalysis. And through his work with patients over the years, he came to believe that the self was divided into 3 parts, which he referred to as the id, the ego and the superego. And the id was seen as sort of the primal animalistic part of the self that operates according to the pleasure principle. The ego develops later, which is kind of your separate sense of a self separate from other people. In other words, your awareness of being an individual, that's what we call the ego. You don't develop that until a little bit later. We're only born with id, according to Freud. And then later, the superego develops, which is the moral part of the personality that comes from our religious upbringing or from whatever culture we're raised in. But again, the id operated according to what Freud called the pleasure principle. You might say the ego operated according to what Freud referred to as the reality principle, because it was the more rational part of the self, and the superego operating according to principles of morality or the morality principle. And he was one of the earliest theorists to actually point out just how important early childhood is to development. Uh, we now know this to be the case, right? We know that traumas that happen during early childhood can be particularly damaging. Sigmund Freud was one of the earliest people to recognize that, so he should get a lot of credit for that, in addition to kind of getting psychotherapy off the ground. But he did kind of he had some kind of far out ideas of how development proceeded psychologically in terms of his stages of development, which he referred to as the psychosexual stages. And this is perhaps probably the most controversial element, I would say, of his whole theory are his psychosexual stages, which he said were the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. And so just to go through those real quick, the oral stage is the stage of infancy when you're breastfeeding. Pleasure comes through the mouth. So he referred to this as the oral stage. The anal stage is the period of potty training, and hence that period of early childhood referred to as the anal stage. Again, Freud believed if some sort of trauma happened during a particular stage, it could cause you to get fixated at that stage. So if some trauma happened at the oral stage, you could develop what he called an oral fixation, maybe a smoking habit or vaping habit or something. As you can see in this photograph, he himself was a cigar smoker. The habit actually killed him. Uh, but what about the anal stage? If you have some sort of trauma there, he said you might develop what he called an anal retentive personality, which in these modern times we would refer to as like an obsessive compulsive personality or something like that. And then the stage after that was probably his most controversial. At around 5 or 6 years of age, you would enter what's referred to as the phallic stage. This is when children become aware of their own genitalia and also develop this crisis where they come to become really possessive of their opposite sex parents. So in the Oedipal crisis, the little boy version, basically what he says happens is the little boy gets really possessive of mom and gets jealous of dad and has this fantasy of getting rid of dad, but then slowly comes to the realization that he can't get rid of dad. He'll never be able to defeat dad. So he realizes that he has to join with dad, and dad becomes his model for masculinity. And then later in adult life, he'll pick a partner that reminds him of his mother because he couldn't have he couldn't possess his mother as a child. Dad won that war, right? But later on, men will grow up to pick partners that remind them of their mothers. And another part of this is he was assuming kind of heterosexuality and assuming that kids have both parents around, which is not always a safe assumption to make. But but again, he thought that one would become very possessive of one's opposite sex and this is a crisis that children had to work through. The female version of it, he referred to as the electric complex. And he believed that this crisis was the way that we develop our gender identity and our sexual preferences. And again, there really isn't any real scientific evidence for these ideas in terms of his psychosexual stages. Uh, those ideas have kind of been fully discredited. So, Freud had some good ideas and some bad ideas. One of his better ideas, I would say, was his idea of the unconscious or unconscious, I would say. This idea of the unconscious is Freud's idea that most of what drives our behavior is actually below our level of awareness. Like the id and the superego, for example, are subconscious, and it's only the ego that's the conscious part of the self that you see on the surface, but what really drives people is the id and the superego, all our fantasies and fears and guilts and that sort of thing that we've shoved into our subconscious that we don't want to face. So Freud thought that we all had things that we didn't want to face, that we were, hiding from, which there's probably some wisdom to that, right? And he had this idea of what he called defense mechanisms, being those little tricks that the ego uses to avoid facing those things that are really bothering us. So again, Freud had this really powerful idea that a lot of us, have things that we're hiding from, and we would be better off if we faced those things. That's a powerful idea, like I said, and I think it's an idea worth keeping. But again, some of his other ideas around sexual development, particularly, pretty roundly discredited by this point. So, Freud's kind of a mixed bag, but the field had to start somewhere, right? Freud had a lot of well-known students over the years, and perhaps the one of the most well-known of those would be Erik Erikson, who kind of modified Freud's ideas and made them his own. Probably the biggest difference, I would say, between Erikson and Freud was that Freud basically said that development stopped once you reached uh, early childhood. And Freud basically said there were only these five stages, and I think I didn't even mention them all on the last slide. And those stages were the oral, anal, uh, phallic stage, the latency period of middle childhood, and then later the genital stage, which is when puberty hits. And that was Freud's last stage of development. So according to Freud, development stopped once you become sexually mature, which we know is not true, right? We know an 18-year-old is not going to be the same psychologically, say, as a 40-year-old or whatever, that we change throughout our lifespan, right? And this was something that was glaringly missing from Freud's ideas, was that development continues throughout the lifespan. It doesn't just end at adolescence. So Erikson acknowledged this, and he said that each stage of life was important, and that these stages ran all the way into late adulthood, and that these stages were more driven by what he called psychosocial crises than by the psychosexual crises that Freud liked to talk about. Uh, So with Erikson, these stages were 8 stages that he said occur between birth and death, which we'll be going through in later chapters as we move through the course. But what's important to know at this point was each stage is kind of characterized by a crisis that has to be resolved in some way or another, right? So if you develop a sense of mistrust, for example, in the first stage, then that's going to lay the groundwork for you kind of being distrustful of other people and maybe having a paranoid, hostile personality for the rest of your life, stuff like that. Again, we'll get into these ideas in more depth when we move into these particular stages in later chapters. A very important school of thought, an additional very important school of thought in the history of psychology and in human development would be that of behaviorism, or learning theory, as it's sometimes referred to in developmental psychology. And this was largely the work of the behaviorists, as I mentioned a moment ago, who were a group of psychologists that kind of got started with the work of Ivan Pavlov, who wasn't even a psychologist, who was actually a Russian physiologist. But Pavlov was the guy who famously discovered classical conditioning, which was basically the most basic kind of learning, where you learn to associate two things that go together. And he did this by training dogs to salivate in response to the ringing of a bell, which we will see a little bit more of now in this quick video clip.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic, unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work and the work of those who followed him led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
So here's the secret to getting fit, getting good grades, and becoming a confident public speaker.
Right, we shall continue further. So learning theory, as I said, is another very important school of thought in the history of psychology and human development that we will be referring to moving through this course. The behaviorists were very focused on the environment. They were very much a nurture kind of based theory when it comes to the nature-nurture issue. They were soundly on the side of environment. And again, this work started with Ivan Pavlov. This work was later picked up by John B. Watson, who gets credit as kind of being the founder of behaviorism because he was the first real psychologist to apply these principles to humans in his famous and now notorious Little Albert experiment, in which he and his research assistant basically trained an infant to have a phobia of animals through classical conditioning. And another very important figure in the history of learning theory is also B.F. Skinner, who was a Harvard psychology professor who pioneered the use of reinforcement and punishment, as he referred to them, which are terms that have become household names at this point. But B.F. Skinner, with his use of the ideas of reinforcement and punishment, was promoting the idea that a lot of our learning takes place as a consequence of our behaviors. So operant conditioning is learning from the consequences of our behavior, where classical conditioning is basically learning things by association, like Pavlov's dogs did, or like little Albert did. Another important theorist whose name will come up once or twice in this course is that of Albert Bandura, who was a Stanford psychology professor who passed away a couple of years ago. And he was big on the power of the environment to shape learning, and not just in terms of reinforcement and punishment and classical conditioning, but also through observation. He was kind of the pioneer of this idea that we learn things through watching. And he called this modeling. His most famous experiment was what was known as the Bobo doll experiment, where he had children watch a video of adults beating the crap out of a doll, like you see pictured here, and then the children played with the doll after watching the adults beat the crap out of the doll, and that those children were compared to a group of children who did not watch that video first. And of course, what he found was that the children who had watched the video of the adults beating up the doll were much more violent with the doll than the children who did not. Now, of all the names that I brought up so far, probably the one that's going to come up the most in this course, I would say, would probably be Jean Piaget. And then I would probably say Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson would probably get a close second and third place. But there really is no talking about the development of our cognitive faculties without talking about the work of Piaget. Piaget was critical to the development of the field known as cognitive development, which again is the development of our ability to think and use our reason, our ability to make decisions, our ability to use our memories to make better decisions, that sort of thing. All of that was pioneered by the Swiss developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, whose theory of development we're going to be talking about in most of the chapters moving forward in this book, and at least half of them at least. We'll be talking about his four major stages of cognitive development, which I'll show you in the next slide. So he said that development unfolds across these stages through mechanisms that he referred to as assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation occurs when we incorporate new knowledge into our previously existing knowledge frameworks, which he referred to as schema. On the other hand, sometimes new information that we encounter will not fit into our previously held categories, and we have to create a new category or schema, and he referred to that process as accommodation. So those four stages that we'll be talking about in later chapters are the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. So we'll be going into depth into these as we move through the course a bit more closely. And I do assume that all of you are reading your textbook, which is freely available to you on Canvas. Another important figure who kind of pioneered the idea of environment shaping behavior or nurture was the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who was also into studying cognitive development, who lived in the early 20th century, but his work really didn't become well known until after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s. But his idea was that we learn best when we have a competent teacher that could be an adult or a peer, but when we have a competent teacher encouraging us to get just outside of our comfort zone. So that zone where we get challenged, but not so challenged that it's impossible. It's sort of that sweet spot, right? Where it's just kind of a challenge just a little beyond your current ability, but it's not so out of the question that you're setting yourself up for failure. So according to Vygotsky, good teachers know how to teach within children or a learner's zone of proximal development, which again is that area where you learn best, which is it's challenging, but not so challenging to make it impossible. Information processing theories of cognitive development will come up here and there in this class. This is one of the newer theories that you'll see out there. It's been around for a while now, but newer than the others we've been talking about. Information processing theory basically works by comparing the human brain to kind of a computer, really, for lack of a better word. Sometimes you'll hear these folks refer to the brain as a computer made of meat. But basically, these folks got away from stage models. They said development is more continuous. And instead of development proceeding in terms of qualitative changes, where the way that we think fundamentally changes from one stage to the next, instead, it's more of a slow adding of abilities over time. So, according to the information processing theorists, development is more like a wheelchair ramp than a staircase. Another well-known theorist who's been influential over the years, whose name might come up once or twice, maybe not as much as some of these others, is Yuri Bronfenbrenner and his ecological systems theory, which was this grand theory which just tried to account for everything that could affect development from a biopsychosocial perspective. So it's a really grand theory. Like I said, it tries to count everything, but by trying to account for everything, it's kind of difficult to test. Some of these big grand theories are difficult to empirically test. The best theories, I think, generate specific testable hypotheses, and I think a lot of my colleagues in the field would agree with me on that. But the problem with ecological systems theories and grand theories like it, and even I would say a lot of Freud's ideas too, is that a lot of these grand theories, like I said, are difficult to scientifically verify. But again, Bronfenbrenner's idea was that the individual is nested into a bunch of different systems, which he referred to as the microsystem, the mesosystem, and the exosystem, and the macrosystem. And these are all basically contexts that the individual is nested in that affect the person's development. And some of them might affect the kid's development more or less at different stages. So, for example, when you're a young child, it's your family of origin that's going to have the greatest effect on you. But as you mature and move into school, your peers start to have more influence on you than your parents do as you move into adolescence. Okay, so the remainder of the chapter deals with the topic of research methods. And for this purpose, I have an in-class activity that is to go along with the video that I'm about to play. So you will find the quiz that goes along with this video in Canvas. It is called the Discovering Psychology quiz. So as you watch this video, there will be some questions on that quiz that you will be able to answer as we follow along. Again, this is a video called Understanding Research from a series called Discovering Psychology, and the quiz that goes along with this video can be found in Canvas.
Annenberg Media.
What methods do psychologists use to probe human nature?
No.
How can we tell if this magician really has psychic powers? What is the placebo effect, and why is it important?
Do you have any money with you right now that you have taken from the desk? No.
Can we trust the results of a lie detector? Understanding research, this time on discovering psychology.
So, which
Psychologists face a difficult task when they set out to understand the nature of behavior and the workings of the brain and mind. This researcher is trying to draw an accurate picture of the brain's electrical activity associated with different mental illnesses. But he and his colleagues have one strong ally that makes success possible: the scientific method, a set of general procedures for gathering and interpreting data.
Eyes closed and keep your mouth slightly open.
To be accurate, data must be collected from carefully controlled observations and measurements. And other researchers working independently must be able to obtain the same results using the same methods.
What kinds of places do you usually go to when you want to meet somebody either that you want to have a relationship with?
Interviews, surveys, questionnaires, and psychological tests are some of the methods psychologists use to explore our personalities, values, talents, and the effects of our environment. Take, for example, the work of psychologist Christina Maslach of the University of California at Berkeley. She applies research methods to study job burnout, where stress, lack of support, and negative self-evaluation impair job performance and personal well-being. Dr. Maslach uses psychometric research, a system of developing a standardized method for collecting data and assessing psychological phenomena.
This is research that started in the real world. But what it meant was that we were doing interviews, we were doing surveys, we were going out into the workplace, trying to understand what it was that people were experiencing. Look at this one. We would then develop new versions of the surveys or interview questions, and eventually began to develop a standardized measure of the phenomenon that we were getting. And so there was a whole period of psychometric research. We got terrific results in terms of how many people...
By refining her methodology, Dr. Maslach has developed a scale to measure job burnout. The scale is a practical implementation of her research that she brings into the workplace to assist others in making their work environments more effective.
What I have done is begun to move towards an applied research with organizations rather than just with individuals, where we provide them with the tools to do an organizational self-assessment on the health of the workplace. One of the exciting things about going out and working in these different organizations or doing the interviews is that I always come back with some new insights or new questions, and that kind of fuels the research. It's exciting to be able to see this process, this partnership go back and forth, so that you think we're making progress. We're actually learning something that is making a difference for people.
By adapting her research to address the concerns of our workplace environments, Dr. Maslach demonstrates that real life is one kind of laboratory where both the subjects and the researcher reap the benefits. Some psychologists conduct experiments in laboratories like this one, designed for carefully controlling conditions and measuring behavior. The laboratory is one place where scientists test hypotheses, that is, predictions of how two or more factors are likely to be related. To test a hypothesis, researchers randomly assign some subjects to an experimental group, which receives the treatment. Other subjects are assigned to the control group that does not receive the treatment. The results are then compared. Other research is carried out in the field, where naturally occurring ongoing behavior can be observed. This researcher is studying how the social behavior of baboons affects their health.
looks like
Psychological research is also conducted in locations as unusual as this Air Force flight simulator. Wherever it happens and whatever methods are used, basic psychological research carried out scientifically gives us a good shot at the truth. And if we understand how these researches separate fact from fiction, perhaps we too can avoid some of the pitfalls of faulty reasoning and unwarranted conclusions in our everyday lives. The point here is not to make you all practicing psychologists, but to make you better consumers of would-be facts and theories, especially those you take for granted. One of the most remarkable things about us humans is how many of our beliefs we accept without question. These beliefs form a subjective reality that can influence how we perceive the world. They can affect our everyday plans, whom we choose to associate with and trust, and even our health. Some of our beliefs come from our culture. For example, what it teaches us about male and female roles, beauty, and courage. And each culture has its own belief systems and sense of humor.
Lactel, les mamelles de la France.
Other powerful beliefs come from each individual's experiences and motivations, developed through personal interaction with the world. Our individual experience may also include the learning of critical thinking skills, so that we can test our beliefs against scientific understanding.
What were the main ideas from what you read?
They danced around fire, loud and loud and faster and faster.
If we don't learn how to think critically, we may believe in the unproven and the unexplained. Or become willing recruits in a never-ending stream of religious, social, and political cults. True believers who blindly accept authority rather than think for themselves. Research reveals that for many of the 25 million Americans without high school diplomas, the world can be a confusing and threatening place. These people often feel that they are controlled by fate and can do little to control their own lives. Many of them are also inclined to believe in psychic predictions, mystical forces, and cosmic signs, as do some better educated people. In fact, belief in mystical forces such as Haitian voodoo can be so potent that it can transform psychological and biological reality, for better or for worse. It can sometimes cure the sick or kill the healthy. At the Johns Hopkins University, common features shared by miracle cures, faith healing, political and religious conversions, and psychotherapy are studied by research psychiatrist Jerome Frank.
All forms of psychological healing, that is, trying to influence people through words, share certain common healing features. I guess the first of those is the kind of relationship with a healer, a person who inspires confidence in the patient, makes him feel he can trust him, inspires the patient's hopes. It's a very important ingredient. And then there's always a healing setting of some kind, almost always, a shrine, let us say, or a doctor's office, or a clinic even.
Feet were sort of cemented down to the floor.
Inaction, frozen. There is a third that I guess they have in common, and that's they increase a patient's sense of mastery, of control over what's happening. See, the thing human beings can at least stand is chaos. That's the most frightening experience there is. And anything that gives people a sense that they're in control again is a very important boost to their morale. And mentioning that one brings up a common feature of all these procedures, and that is if they work at all, they do it through arousing the person emotionally. He feels things as a result, happy or sad or frightened or angry. Mainly, I would say relief. Sometimes anxiety, because you get into areas that make him more anxious, make him or her more anxious than before. Belief is really crucial to a healing process of any sort, because without the belief, the person does not participate in any real way. They may go through the motions, they may listen politely, as many patients do, but nothing happens to them unless they really believe that this can help them.
Sometimes it is the power of this belief that a treatment will work that results in the cure, and not any special power of the supposed treatment itself. The scientific term for this phenomenon is the placebo effect. In medicine, a placebo is a substance such as a sugar pill that has no direct pharmacological effect, but which can have a therapeutic effect on pain and sickness in people who believe it will work. History suggests that placebos have been responsible for much of the therapeutic success of treatments throughout the centuries. In ancient Egypt, patients were often treated with lizard's blood and crocodile dung. Later, physicians used leeches to suck the blood of patients, or made their patients vomit, or froze them, or overheated them. Many of these patients died, but those who survived often swore by their treatment. Just think of how many more testimonials there might have been if these physicians had been content to use just sugar pills. Okay. Placebos can be so effective that virtually any credible, socially sanctioned treatment administered in an appropriate context can have a moderate success.
Okay, I didn't even feel that. Rays come out from your body, from that center.
Even the mere believable suggestion that a treatment will work is sufficient to make about 1/3 of sick people feel better, according to recent studies. You can imagine, though, how the placebo effect complicates the job of a researcher. How do you know whether it's a specific treatment that's working or just the fact of being given any treatment? One solution is what's known as the double-blind procedure. You give some subjects the real treatment and others the placebo, and don't tell them which is which. In fact, even the researcher or therapist giving out the treatment can't know, so the results won't be biased. Sometimes, of course, the problem isn't bias, but outright fraud. Every year, so-called miracle healers deceive thousands of sick people. These charlatans want to make money, not provide cures. Unexplained phenomena, especially if you don't look too closely, are the foundation of alleged psychic powers, miracle cures, UFOs, and all sorts of crackpot theories. But they're also the professional magician's stock and trade. So for some tips on explaining the unexplainable, we turn to a man who always has something up his sleeve, the amazing Darrell Bem.
I would like to present a demonstration of mind reading, not one in which I read someone else's mind, but one in which Lisa attempts to read my mind. I have here a set of cards. I have one of the cards in mind. You do not know which one that is. I want you to concentrate and then touch any particular card that appeals to you.
This card.
Okay, do you care to change your mind?
No.
You have selected the Jack of Diamonds. Believe it or not, you have read my mind, and you have read my chest.
Can we conclude that a psychic event has taken place? What would a psychologist say? Let's ask Darrell Bem.
In real life, I'm a psychologist, not an illusionist. And as any psychologist can tell you, the demonstration you've just seen is the worst way to do an experiment. Nevertheless, it enables me to mention some of the things that a psychologist would use to safeguard the hypothesis that's being tested. Let us suppose that psychologists did want to test the hypothesis that Lisa and I did have some kind of psychic communication. Before one could even entertain such a hypothesis, one would first have to rule out two other possibilities. The first one you rule out is that it was merely chance, that only chance was operating. We had 6 cards in this case. By pure coincidence, it could have been 1 out of 6. Would that have convinced you? It wouldn't have convinced psychologists either. Let us suppose that the psychologists have now ruled out that the demonstration you saw was just due to chance. Again, we are not ready to conclude that what you have seen is something psychic. because there are many alternative possibilities. If this were to be done as an actual experiment, I would never be permitted to be in the same room with Lisa. These are called procedural controls, and that is the second thing that a psychologist always tries to do, rule out alternative hypotheses. Another safeguard that we didn't put into place was that I didn't tell you ahead of time what the hypothesis was. I told you that we had psychic communication, but I didn't tell you which card would constitute evidence for that psychic communication. Did you notice that it wasn't until she had turned over the Jack of Diamonds that I announced that that was the correct card and showed you my T-shirt? Perhaps it occurred to you that I have 52 T-shirts. Not actually, but I did something quite comparable. Suppose, for example, that she had not selected the Jack of Diamonds. Suppose instead that she had selected a different card, the Five of Clubs. Since she didn't know the plot line ahead of time, I simply would have said, that's exactly the card I was thinking of, the Five of Clubs. And so I would have been correct even if she had selected that one. Suppose she had selected a different card, the Four of Spades. In that case, I simply would have said, that's exactly the one I was thinking of. And so forth. And so, in fact, there was never any possibility that chance was operating. I don't leave things to chance. But a psychologist who'd well designed an experiment would have ruled out all of these things.
Here's where experimental research comes in. When a number of factors might be responsible for an observed effect, and we want to know which one deserves the credit, then we have to do an experiment. The essence of an experiment is systematic manipulation or variation of one or more factors while holding constant all the others that might be important. The effects of these manipulated events on some behavioral reaction are then assessed. So even when we know a dramatic change has occurred, we can't assume to know why.
20/80. You did?
And we also have to resist the temptation to conclude that things that are correlated, that occur together, are causally related. Many things that seem to be related as cause and effect aren't. Often it's a third factor that's causing the other two. For instance, when we learn that children's grades on achievement tests go down as the number of hours they spend watching television goes up, we can't conclude that TV causes bad grades, or that the key to better grades is parents turning off the TV set. Instead, it could be that less able students watch more television because they don't like school and homework, in which case, being less able causes their bad grades. Good students may also watch a lot of TV. Another potential problem in analyzing data comes from using small samples to draw significant conclusions.
At the moment, the phenomenon itself, if you could demonstrate it reliably.
Psychologists typically measure a few responses of a small number of subjects in experiments and try to infer something important about human or animal behavior in general. To reduce the possibility of errors, researchers start out with a sample of subjects that is representative of the larger population from which the sample was drawn. The best way to assure this is to draw randomly, by chance. Otherwise, the research may be seriously flawed. Consider Women and Love, a controversial study of women's attitudes towards sex and marriage, which made headlines across the country. According to the author of the study, Cher Haidt, 98% of married women said they were dissatisfied with some major aspect of their relationship, and 75% said they had had extramarital affairs. But only 4% of the women who received Haidt's survey had mailed in their responses. And these women may well have been motivated to reply because they were unhappy, making the sample hopelessly biased. When the same questions that Cher Haidt asked were posed to a sample of women who were randomly selected, the results were very different. According to a survey by ABC News and the Washington Post, 93% said they were satisfied with their relationships, and only 7% reported having affairs. So beware of science-coded journalism, where numbers are used to convey the aura of science, but the methods used to collect them are flawed. And while we're at it, let's beware of pseudoscientific technology as well. This is a polygraph test, better known as a lie detector test. Every year, over 2 million Americans take one. But does it work? Psychologist Leonard Sachs of Boston University is an expert on the use and misuse of polygraphs.
Unfortunately, hundreds of thousands, millions of people are subjected to these tests. It determines whether they get jobs, it determines whether they go to jail, it determines whether they get custody of their children, it determines whether they can work in the most important positions in our government, in the most sensitive positions in our government. And the problem is that the test doesn't work. It's not a valid test. It can be defeated. It can be wrong.
Is today May 26th?
Yes. The instrument that's used is a polygraph, measures some very simple measures of what's called autonomic arousal. Person's heart rate, person's sweating, and the rate of breathing. No.
The tester asks a number of controlled questions where the subject is assumed to tell the truth. The subject's arousal is then compared to his arousal in response to relevant questions where he may be lying.
Have you ever taken something that didn't belong to you before?
No. People who lie are sometimes nervous, and sometimes their heart goes faster, and sometimes they sweat more. But it's also true that people who are just concerned about an issue show the same reactions. Vice versa, it's also true that people who lie sometimes don't sweat, don't have their heart racing, and so there's no direct connection and there's no unequivocal connection between lying and these physiological states of arousal.
Recently, Congress asked Sachs and his colleagues to test the validity of lie detectors. Sachs set up an experiment where subjects were allowed to take money from a desk drawer. They were then given a lie detector test. If they could pass the test, they could keep the money.
No. Do you have any money with you right now that you have taken from the desk?
No.
Some subjects were told that any lie detector can be deceived. Others were told that this lie detector was always accurate. The results were clear. Those who believed that the polygraph test did not work were able to deceive it. Those who believed it worked were for the most part caught, and some innocent subjects failed the test.
No.
A polygraph is a prop. It's a theatrical device, if you will. If a polygrapher can convince the subject, and they're very good at convincing people, if they can convince the subject that the test works, if the subject is guilty, they're going to be nervous. They're going to think that they can be detected. If, on the other hand, the subject knows that this is just theater, that the polygrapher can't really tell what they're thinking, they're not going to be afraid. They're not going to be nervous about being caught.
Clearly, getting at the truth is a difficult proposition. But fortunately, there are a few guidelines we can follow to avoid the most common pitfalls. First, find out who the subjects were in any study, how many of them participated, and how they were selected. Avoid the assumption that two things that go together are cause and effect. Correlation is not necessarily causation. Remember that seeing isn't believing if important information might be kept from you. Question any data that aren't collected using the rigorous procedures of the scientific method. Any conclusion about human behavior is only as good as the data on which it is based. Keep in mind the power of placebos to alter reality. Restrain your enthusiasm for scientific breakthroughs until the results have been replicated by other researchers. And above all, beware of people claiming absolute truth and simple solutions for the many uncertainties and complexities of human nature. Scientific conclusions are always tentative, never absolute, and open to change should better data come along. In our next program, we're going to use our critical thinking to explore the very core of psychology, the brain. It's the biological base
So just bear that in mind as you are watching the various lectures throughout the course. So today we are going to talk about research methods within the field of psychology. And it's interesting to note that most of the research methods that we talk about that pertain to the field of psychology also pertain to the social sciences more broadly. The social sciences tend to rely on very similar research methods in a cross-disciplinary fashion. So I've titled this lecture, How Do We Know? An Overview of Research Methods, because it gets to the core of the theme of this segment of Chapter 1, which deals with the question of epistemology. And going back to the first lecture, you might recall our discussion of how psychology as a discipline was historically rooted from within the discipline of philosophy. And one of the major questions that philosophers have concerned themselves for thousands of years is the question of how do we know what's true and what isn't? How do we evaluate claims to truth? How do we evaluate claims to knowledge? So in this chapter, we're going to look at the ways in which social scientists go about evaluating theories and ideas within the social sciences, and more specifically, psychology. Also keep in mind that this is a very introductory level lecture on the topic. So each of the topics that we discussed today, very briefly, we could spend hours and hours discussing each one of them with concern to how to carry out their methodologies and the theories behind them, etc. So if you really want a more in-depth coverage of research methods within the social sciences, you'll probably have to take a research methods course, either at the undergraduate or the graduate level, because we really can't go into any level of extreme depth in an intro-level course. So with that disclaimer out of the way, we'll go ahead and continue our discussion of research methods. So I begin by looking at the fact that there are a lot of claims that you will hear about the mind in pop culture and within the media. Maybe you've heard of the Baby Einstein video series. It's not as popular as it used to be, and you'll find out why momentarily. But there was a claim that was made that watching these Baby Einstein videos or similar videos like it could somehow make your child more intelligent later in life, and that these sorts of videos like Baby Einstein, and you hear about things like the Mozart effect and all of these things that are purported to make your children smarter when they're older. You know, is there any truth to these sort of claims? Well, these sorts of video series have been evaluated experimentally, particularly I'm thinking of a research study that was conducted out of the University of Washington, if I remember correctly, where these sorts of claims were evaluated. And there was no evidence that having your children watch videos like Baby Einstein or other similar video series could make your child more intelligent later in life. So the intentions may be good behind these sorts of products, but hopefully after taking this course, when you see these sorts of claims and advertisements and in the popular media, you'll have a little bit more of a skeptical approach to these sorts of claims, and you might ask yourself the question, well, how did they determine that? What sort of research methodology did they use? Did they have a random sample of participants, for example? Did they use an experimental method? Perhaps they only used correlational methods. These are the sorts of questions that you might want to ask yourself when you're hearing about scientific claims in the media. And we hear these sorts of claims all the time. I think of whether or not you should drink a glass of wine a day debate, depending on which news article you read. It depends that it just seems to depend. You know, one day drinking a glass of wine every day is good for your heart. The next day it's not so great for you. So you want to look at the overall body of knowledge when it comes to a particular research question. You don't just want to focus on one study. So today we're going to talk about three broad types of research methods that are used to evaluate claims about human behavior and claims about the mind. But before we get to the three broad types of research methods that are usually used within the social sciences and within the discipline of psychology, let's compare the scientific method to some other ways of ascertaining knowledge. Perhaps the most popular way to gain knowledge in this world is to take the expert's word for it. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, because experts are experts for a reason. Apparently, they have some sort of authority or expertise on the subject matter that they're speaking on. But when it comes to the scientific method, we can't just rely upon the word of someone we trust just because we trust them. How is it that they came to that knowledge? Is there something more than just their authority that backs up their claim to truth? So authority might be a perfectly useful way to gain knowledge in our everyday life, but when it comes to evaluating claims of truth scientifically, it's certainly not going to cut it. Similarly, speaking the tradition of or the method of tradition, or sometimes referred to as tenacity, is a similar sort of idea to the idea of authority, but this is just kind of the idea that, well, this is what we've always believed, and everybody sort of takes it for granted as being the truth. Just like people used to just assume that the sun revolved around the earth. It was a belief that was handed down that had a lot of tenacity, and also some degree of authority behind it with the backing of religious figures such as the Roman Catholic Church. But believing something just because we've always believed it, well, that's certainly not a scientific reason to agree with a claim to truth or to agree with a particular theory. We certainly need more than, well, this is just what we've always believed. And the next one, intuition. This is something that we also rely upon quite frequently in our interpersonal lives. Oftentimes when we meet a new person, we get a first impression about that person, and often that, sometimes not, but usually that first impression will be pretty trustworthy, and we usually go with our gut. And when you go with your gut, we might say that you're trusting your intuition. You just seem to get a feeling about certain people or certain things, and that you just feel like this is the truth, whatever this is. But your intuition, you don't know exactly why you're coming to this conclusion, but your intuition tells you that you're on the right track. And there's certainly nothing wrong with relying on your gut or your intuition in your interpersonal life, in your everyday life, but it's certainly not a worthwhile method when it comes to evaluating claims about the nature of reality, claims of scientific truth. We have to get away from relying on our intuition as well. The last method that I want to talk about in this slide is logic, sometimes referred to as reasoning. And when it comes to the 4 ways of answering questions listed on this slide, logic is the closest thing to the scientific method. It's not quite the scientific method, but logic or reasoning, this is the tool of the philosophers. And oftentimes you will see logic or reasoning represented in thought experiments that are often utilized within the discipline of philosophy. But the key point here is that in most cases, there are no data that are being collected and analyzed. There's not actual research happening. That usually this is within the realm of thought experiments, particularly when it pertains to the discipline of philosophy. Not always, but that's often the case. So logic, although respectable and useful even within academic settings, is not even quite to the level that we need for a method of inquiry to be considered scientific. So what constitutes the scientific method? What distinguishes this method from those 4 methods that we just discussed? Well, here are some key elements that you can remember about the scientific method. For one, when science is conducted, ideally speaking, in most cases at least, the results of the research should be public, meaning that anybody can go out and witness the experiment or even conduct it themselves if they want to do what's called a replication. But you should be able to find out how the researchers did what they did, witness their results, or at least replicate them themselves, replicate them yourself, rather. So there's this public aspect to science. There's also the sense in which, on a related note to it being public, there's an objectivity to the scientific method. Everybody should be able to look at what's going on and agree that this is actually what's happening, that we can all bear witness to the results that we're getting and agree that this is actually what's happening. And there's as little room for subjective interpretation of the results as possible. Ideally speaking, the more objective your measurements can be, the more scientific you are. When we say that the scientific method is empirical, What this means is that it relies upon the methods of the senses. So if it's information that can be detected by the sensory organs of your body, in terms of the data that are being collected, if it's empirical, that means that they are data that can be analyzed and witnessed through the five senses. Traditionally speaking, that's what we mean by empirical. When we say that science is systematic, that means that the scientific method is carried out in a controlled, rigorous way. Everything is planned out in advance. You're not flying by the seat of your pants, so to speak. There's a method to the madness, and there's a rigorousness to the way that the scientific method is carried out. Finally, we also say that the scientific method is cumulative and self-correcting. So what we mean by cumulative is that you look at the body of findings when it comes to a particular research question. We try to stay away from just judging reality by the results of one study. But if you have lots of studies that repeat the same pattern of results, then you say that you have a cumulative set of findings that you can rely upon. And the more cumulative your findings are, the more reliable, the more you can say that you're probably finding truth, so to speak. And we could debate the nature of truth philosophically, but the more results that you have to support your findings, the stronger your findings are. We also sometimes find within the field of science that we have to admit that we were wrong about something that we previously held as a scientific doctrine. And this is what we mean by self-correcting. Scientists have had to admit that they were wrong a number of times over the years. I'll give us a specific example of this momentarily. But when we're wrong, we admit that we're wrong, and we go wherever the data leads. So there is no, ultimately, our allegiance is to the data. As a famous mentor of mine in graduate school once said to me, show me the data. And if the data say that the truth lies elsewhere than what we previously believed, and that's the direction that we have to go. So the sciences are self-correcting. Finally, ultimately, the goal of understanding the world and the goal of having an idea of how the world works and what the truths about the real world are, the purpose of all of that is to be able to predict and control the world around us, ultimately. All of this information would be of little use to us if we couldn't put it to use in a predictive manner. When I think prediction, I think of meteorology, for example, which is the science of trying to predict the weather. There would be no point in doing meteorology if we could not use those findings and that science in our everyday lives in some sort of way. And this applies to all the sciences, that we're trying to get an idea of how to predict the world around us more accurately and reliably. But in another sense, we're also trying to exercise some degree of control over that world as well by intervening and using the findings of science to make the world a more hospitable and comfortable place to live for human beings. So those are the key elements of the scientific method. A moment ago, I said that I would share an example of how the scientific method is self-correcting. And this is an example from within our own discipline of psychology, or more specifically from the discipline of neuroscience, which is intimately related to the field of psychology. For many years, within the field of neurology and within the field of neuroscience, there was a belief that once you had a fully biologically mature adult brain, by sometime around the early 20s, that the brain was essentially done developing for the most part, and that there weren't any new neurons that would come into existence within the brain or nervous system. And the neuron, of course, as we'll talk about later in the chapter on the brain, is the basic cell of the nervous system, that fundamentally. But there was a belief that once you reached full biological maturity, that there were no new neurons that grew in the human brain. And in recent years, this is a doctrine that we've had to replace now with the knowledge that there are new neurons that develop within the brain throughout the lifespan. Now, the number of them we're not exactly sure, but we know that within certain areas of the brain, like the hippocampus, for example, or the caudate nucleus, that there are at least a limited number of new neurons that spring into existence throughout the human lifespan. Sorry about that. So we this is an example of how we often have to change our views when new evidence comes in. So science is self-correcting, and this is a fine example of that, and a recent one too, within the last couple of decades. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that we were going to talk about three broad types of research methods within psychology and the social sciences more broadly. And broadly speaking, there are three general categories of research that you will see in the social sciences: descriptive methods, correlational methods, and experimental methods. So today I'm just going to briefly talk about what those are so that you have at least a basic level understanding of these three types of research methods. So initially, descriptive methods simply describe what is occurring. Descriptive methods are not the most sophisticated level of analysis within science. It's often a starting point, a way of documenting something that's occurring in the world. For example, you might have an observational study. Let's say you have a preschool teacher or an elementary school teacher who wants to measure how many instances of aggression are occurring on average per day within that particular teacher's classroom, and which children are engaging in most of the aggressive behaviors. So you might conduct an observational study, or the teacher would have a behaviorist come in and document all the instances of aggression and which children engaged in which aggressive behaviors at which times. And then you could plot that information on a graph over time, and this could give the teacher an idea of which one of her students were engaging in these behaviors most often, and how often the behaviors were occurring, what time of day, for example. So these data would be a useful starting point for understanding what's happening in that classroom. You certainly, with descriptive data, wouldn't be making any inferences about why this is happening. You're just simply observing things that are happening in the world around you without attempting to make any attributions as to the cause of those events. Another form of descriptive methods that you will sometimes see utilized in the social sciences are self-report data, where people fill out surveys and questionnaires reporting on their own behavior. Case studies are a more in-depth form of descriptive research. Often they take on the form of what's known as qualitative descriptive research, where the information that's yielded is non-numerical, where it's verbal information or written information about an in-depth case that a particular researcher is studying. Qualitative data is much more difficult to analyze statistically. However, qualitative data can often yield very rich, detailed information that you often can't get with numerical data. So many case studies you will see have this sort of qualitative flavor. And some researchers are very fond of using case studies, which are in-depth studies of one research participant. Sigmund Freud, for example, was particularly fond of the case study method. Almost all of his psychoanalytic work and theories were based upon the case studies of his own patients that he worked with. But what all of these descriptive methods have in common is that they're simply documenting something that's happening in the world, but usually there are not inferences being made about the causes of those events. It's just simply descriptive information, hence descriptive research. The next level of sophistication up, you might say the intermediate level of sophistication when it comes to social science research, is correlational research. So with correlational research, you're simply measuring relationships that exist between two variables. And when we use the term variable, what we mean is anything in the world that can be measured that changes. So anything that changes is considered a variable. So correlational research looks at how two or more variables are related to each other. And a vast amount of social science research is based upon correlational findings. Correlational findings have value. You'll often hear correlational research denigrated, but it is not useless research. It can definitely give you some clues about what's happening in the world. The problem with correlational research, however, actually, there's two problems with correlational research. You have the directionality problem, and you have the third variable problem. And it's these two problems. For these two reasons, you cannot make causal statements with correlational data. You can't make causal statements with descriptive data, and you cannot make causal statements with correlational data. And the reason why, two reasons why you can't make causal statements about correlational data are the directionality problem and the third variable problem. So let's say, for example, you look at the classic statistic. That's such a difficult word to say for so many of us. But there is a statistic that has been reported on where you will observe a positive correlation between the number of ice cream cones consumed, or we'll just say amount of ice cream in general. We'll say there's a positive correlation between the amount of ice cream that's being consumed by a given population and the number of shark attacks that occur within that given population. So that's a real correlation. You can look that up. And can we assume from that correlation that eating ice cream causes people to get attacked by sharks? Of course not. There's no real causal relationship between those two things, but they happen to be correlated with each other. As one goes up, the other tends to go up. And when you think about this for a moment, you can easily see why. People tend to eat more ice cream when it's warmer outside, right? And people also tend to go swimming at the beach more often when it's more warm outside during the summer. So people do both things more often when it's a hotter temperature. So the real reason why people are eating more ice cream is because it's hotter outside, and the reason why people are going swimming is because it's hotter outside. So that means that there's going to be a correlation between ice cream rate of ice cream consumption and the number of shark attacks that you see in a given population. So in this case, we have what's called a spurious correlation, because it's a real correlation that's been documented, but it's not really meaningful. And you can see these sorts of meaningless correlations throughout the literature. You can look up a number of them online. Just look up list of meaningless correlations, and I'm sure you'll find some if you Google it, and some of them are pretty funny. So when you have correlations, you got to be careful about making causal statements. You really shouldn't with correlational research, because there's always the possibility that you have a meaningless or spurious correlation. And in the case of the ice cream rate consumption and shark attack, that's an example of the third variable problem. So with the third variable problem, there's a third variable that's really responsible between the correlation, the two variables that are correlated. In this case, the third variable would be how hot it is outside. That's your third variable. Another problem with correlational research that prevents us from making causal statements is the directionality problem. And the directionality problem is often posed by philosophers as the chicken and the egg problem. It's the question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? And it's almost an impossible question to answer. And with correlational research, it's similarly impossible to tell which variable is responsible for the change in the other, if we even assume that there is a real causal relationship. So to give another example, let's say you do a study and you find that children who spend more time playing on their tablets or phones every night, you measure it, and you find that the more times children spend playing on their phones per day, the lower their GPAs in school, the lower their grades. So that would be a negative correlation. So the more time you spend on the phone, the lower your grades, right? Here we have a good example of the directionality problem, because it could be the case that all the time they're spending playing on their phone is causing them to not study and causing their grades to drop. Or it could be that they were just poor students to begin with, and they're just not very good students for whatever reason. And maybe kids who just aren't very good students like to play on their phones more than kids who are very good students. So you just don't know which variable is causing the change in the other. So the directionality problem and the third variable problem prevent us from making causal statements about correlations. With that said, a lot of social science research does rely upon correlational findings, and they're not necessarily always meaningless. Sometimes correlations can really cue you into something that needs further investigation. But if you really want to know that one variable is causing a change in the other, the only way that you can really do that is to conduct an experiment, which is the third type of research method that I want to briefly talk about today. So with the experimental method, what you have are two groups of people at minimum. you have what's called a control group and a treatment group. And the control group is given some sort of treatment, like a drug, for example, and the control group is not given the drug, they're given a sugar pill, and you look at how they change in some outcome. So a classic example of an experimental study would be your clinical trial that's conducted by pharmaceutical companies to test a new drug. Let's say you work for a pharmaceutical company and you want to test a new antidepressant. So the variable that we're interested in affecting is depression. So in this case, our dependent variable in this experiment would be the depression. So your dependent variable is the variable that you're trying to affect a change in. On the other hand, your independent variable is the treatment that you are administering that you are hoping is going to affect a change in the dependent variable. So in this case, we would operationally define depression. We might say if folks earn a certain score on a depression questionnaire, then they're categorized as depressed. So we would operationally define our terms. In this case, depression would be defined as a certain score on a depression questionnaire, and you would measure the effect of the drug on their depression levels. So the way it would work is you would give the treatment group the drug, and you would give the control group the fake drug. It would probably be a sugar pill, what's known as a placebo. And then several months later, you might follow up and retest them on their depression levels. And if you saw that the treatment group who received the new drug was significantly less depressed than the control group who had received the sugar pill, and you had conducted your experiment rigorously, then you might be able to say that your findings supported the idea that the drug is an effective treatment for depression. Now, on the other hand, if you don't really see any differences after treatment between the control group and the treatment group, then you don't have very good evidence that you've got an effective treatment for depression. So that would be an example, a classic example of an experiment. So you have your independent variable, which is your treatment. In this case, it would be whether or not you receive the drug, and your dependent variable would be the outcome of depression and whether or not the drug had changed your depression levels. So your dependent variable would be depression levels in this particular scenario. So I talked about the control group and the experimental group. I just want to reiterate the meanings of those terms. So again, the control group is the group that does not receive the treatment. So in our particular example, our control group would be the group of people that receive the sugar pill. On the other hand, the folks who receive the real drug would constitute the experimental group. So in the experimental method, we want to make sure that we rule out the possibility that our results could be due to anything other than our treatment. So you have to exercise rigorous control over your procedures and methods when conducting an experiment. You don't want any outside variables to creep in that could possibly affect your results. And the possibility of that would be called confounding. So a confound is any possible variable that you might inadvertently allow to creep into your study that could invalidate your results. So for example, a confound that relates to the assignment, I apologize, a possible confound an experiment relates to your sampling procedure. So going back to our example of the controlled clinical trial for an antidepressant, let's say hypothetically that we assigned all the least depressed people, all the mildly depressed people to the treatment group, and the more severely depressed people to the control group. So that would mean that the less depressed people would be getting the new drug, and the more severely depressed people would be getting your sugar pill or placebo. Now, why would this be a problem for our results? Well, it's entirely possible that the less severely depressed people are going to get better anyway, right? It's the severely depressed people that are probably going to be more difficult to treat. So if we give the severely depressed people a fake drug, of course they're going to be less likely to show positive changes because they're not even getting the real drug, and they're more severely depressed in the first place. So this would be a real problem. So to avoid this sort of confounding with regards to sampling, what we would utilize is a random assignment procedure. So we would make sure that both the treatment group and the control group are similar in terms of their participants, so that this sort of thing couldn't happen. And another thing that we might utilize is a double-blind procedure, which isn't listed on this slide, but a double-blind procedure means that the person who's receiving the pill, they don't know whether they're getting the real drug or the placebo. They don't know if they're in the treatment group or the control group. And also the person handing them the pill doesn't know whether they're handing the person the fake drug or the real drug. So both the person handing out the drug and the person receiving the drug, neither one of them know whether that's the real drug or the sugar pill that's being handed over. The pill would probably just have a little barcode on it or code that would be entered that would signify which one it was, so that the person analyzing the results would know, but the person handing out the drug would not know. That way it would not bias them, and the person receiving the drug wouldn't know for sure which drug, whether they were getting the real deal or not. So that would eliminate the possibility of confounding in that way. So double-blind procedures, random assignment, these are just a couple of ways that we can help ensure that confounding doesn't enter into our experimental procedures. And there are a lot of other experimental controls that you will learn about if you ever go on to take any more advanced training in research methods, particularly at the graduate level. But for the purposes of this course, what you guys need to know are the basic idea between the three major types of research methods. Descriptive methods, which simply describe observations from the world; correlational methods, which describe relationships between two or more variables; and the experimental method, which is the only method, when done correctly, which allows a researcher to say that a variable has effected a change in another variable. So you need to know the difference between those broad types of research methods. The last thing that I want to talk about before we close this lecture are the ethical issues that are sometimes involved in conducting research. So the first thing that you want to concern yourself with when you conduct research is that your research has been cleared by an institutional review board, which is often referred to as an IRB. The IRB is the ethics board that's made up of a diverse body of decision makers who approve a given research proposal ethically before it's carried out, to make sure that it meets the standards that we're talking about in this slide. So the things that an institutional review board are going to be concerned about are listed in this slide. So first, they want to make sure that you're protecting the privacy of your research participants. You're not letting the results publicly be known in terms of the responses of any one participant. Of course, when you publish your research findings, the public will be privy to your general pattern of results, but they won't know the specific information that any one particular participant provides. And most likely that information will be conducted anonymously to even further protect that privacy. But protecting the privacy of research participants is extremely important, and confidentiality relates to this as well. So there's a subtle difference between privacy and confidentiality. So privacy is protecting the individual information provided by each research participant. On the other hand, confidentiality is not broadcasting the fact that someone has even participated in your study. So to give a concrete example of this, I'll go to my graduate master's thesis that I conducted at the University of West Florida for my master's in psychology, which involved having research participants fill out a series of questionnaires with regards to their religious affiliation and their sexual behavior patterns. I was interested in the relationship between religiosity and sexual behavior and sexual attitudes. So my participants filled out a battery of surveys with questions about their religious background, their religious beliefs, level of religious commitment, and they filled out questions regarding their attitudes with regards to human sexuality and their self-reported sexual behavior patterns over the last year when they filled out the survey. So privacy means that I would not let any one particular participant's information be shared. So you couldn't come to me and say, hey, I think John Smith participated in your thesis. I want to know, what John Smith's, how many people John's been with in his life, right? Because that was in your survey. So let's say his ex-girlfriend or his girlfriend comes and says, I want to know what John said on his human sexuality survey, something like that. Well, I certainly couldn't share that information with anyone. That would be a gross violation of a participant's privacy. Confidentiality is not even acknowledging in the first place that that person participated in my study at all. So, for example, not only could I not share that person's specific information that they provided, but I also couldn't even admit in the first place that that person had even participated in my study. And that would be protecting the person's confidentiality. So hopefully you can understand the subtle difference between those two things. They're very related terms, but slightly nuanced in their meanings. Informed consent is the idea that your research participants know what they're getting into and that they're fully informed of the nature of the study that they're participating in, and they you provide them information about the nature of the study, and they sign off. Usually they'll sign and date an informed consent form that says, I've been fully made aware of the nature of the study, and consent means that they're welcome to participate or not participate, so you can't coerce someone into participating in your research. And they're also free to discontinue their participation in your research at any time. So they have provided informed consent. They've consented to participate in your research after being informed of the nature of the research. So this brings us to the next related point of deception. So in almost all cases, when conducting research with human participants, you would usually tell them exactly what you're studying, and there would be no surprises. There are some circumstances, however, in which research participants won't be honest with their responses if they knew exactly the nature of the research. You actually see a lot of this in some of the classic social psychology research, like the Milgram shock experiment, for example, which we'll explore in that chapter. But there have been a number of studies over the years where they've had to utilize a little bit of deception when they provide informed consent to the participants, or rather when the participants provide informed consent, because if the participants knew what the study was really about, they would artificially change their behavior, and then you would have a confound that would result from that. It would invalidate the results of the study. So when that happens, occasionally an IRB will approve the use of deception in an experiment where you do deceive your participants a little bit to keep them from behaving artificially, basically to keep them behaving naturally. However, when this happens, the requirement is that when the study is over, you fully debrief your participants and tell them what the experiment was actually about after they've provided the data. So the use of deception in research is tricky. It has to be approved by an ethics board. It is sometimes permissible, but usually ethics boards are pretty stringent about this, and you'll probably have to argue your case to convince the ethics board that your use of deception is justified. So they're usually pretty cautious about that sort of thing when approving research. Finally, you want to make sure that the risk to your participants is not undue, that the benefits of conducting the research outweigh any particular risk to participants. So if you're just filling out a survey, usually it's relatively low risk. But if you're participating in a pharmaceutical trial where you're trying some new drug, where you don't know how this chemical is going to affect your body, risk to participants can become more of a sticky issue with that sort of thing. So it really depends on the nature of the research that you're conducting, just how big of an issue this is going to be. But that sort of thing is always decided by the ethics board, and they will approve your research or not accordingly. So that's what I want you guys to be familiar with from this second half of chapter 1. I want you guys to be familiar with the basic idea of the scientific method and how to distinguish it from other types of knowledge. I want you guys to know the 3 basic types of research: correlational, descriptive, and experimental. And I want you guys to be familiar with the basic principles of research ethics that we've talked about today. So that'll be it for chapter 1. Our next lecture in chapter 2 will cover the topic of the human brain. I'm very excited to talk about that next time, and I will see you guys then.